Elijah Graham.
I'm Aaron Haggard.
I'm Gabe Smith.
And I'm Cameron Alcorn. Our topic is capitalism versus socialism, and we are now open for questions.
Gentlemen, I think the obvious question to ask first is define capitalism, define socialism, so we can pit the two
All right.
against each other.
So the traditional capitalism is like the means of production are owned by private individuals. The free market is used to determine price, income, wealth, and distribution of goods. And for socialism, it's the means of production are owned by the state, and government intervention is used to reallocate resources and more economic.
And if you're looking for a dictionary definition, then capitalism would be an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state, which is just a concise way of putting down in paper everything Elijah said, whereas socialism would be a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole.
The community or by the government.
Or by the government. Okay. Yes.
Community is equal for government.
Yes.
Okay.
So does the topic matter that you have here imply that this is it? These are our choices, you're socialist or you're capitalist?
Today we're kind of just discussing these two. There's obviously more options. There's infinitely more options, but today we're just discussing capitalism versus socialism and then kind of arguing for one side or the other.
The reason that's the case?
Like the reason we're arguing for one or the other, or the reason
Right, is the implication that those are the two most directly opposite each other or among this infinite world of...
They're pretty polar opposite in the way that they go about doing things. I think obviously some of the goals are pretty similar, like reduce poverty and stuff like that, but when it comes to the process of achieving prosperity, both views have completely different processes. And then I guess another reason that we picked these two options is because the rise of democratic socialism or socialism in America, it's obviously a hot topic right now. And these two are probably the most prevalent economic theories.
Gentlemen, can you just give us a pro and con kind of benefits and negative aspects of both of those? Do you maybe do capitalism first and then socialism?
Some of the advantages are mainly for capitalism are like supply and demand. People get the best product for the best price. They have incentives for hard work, and they have economic growth. And I guess for socialism, they want more equality, and they're going to try to overcome market failure. So those are just a few advantages of those two.
Could you define market failure and give some examples?
That's just what I did. I saw it on the chart.
So obviously, probably one of the best examples of a market failure would be the Great Depression in the 1920s. And there were a few different ways that they probably could have overcome that. And the way that, so there were some tariffs introduced right before that time that ultimately prolonged that market failure by 7 years, is what UCLA has come to. They've said that they think that it prolonged the Great Depression for 7 years because they did not let the market, they didn't really let it be free, and they imposed tariffs. Hurdle Cooper did.
Didn't we just impose some tariffs recently? Are we heading towards the Great Depression?
Now, there's obviously a couple different reasons that tariffs could be introduced, and I think most of us up here would agree that tariffs are not necessarily the best thing. Sometimes they can be necessary, sometimes they're not, but it can depend.
We talked about the difference in socialism and capitalism. Really, if you boil it down to its base level, is that the government gets involved in no longer making it a free market, right? The market is no longer free because the government's involved. So couldn't imposing tariffs be considered a socialist activity if the government's getting involved and thumbing the scale on the free market?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it is a socialist thing, but honestly, I would say it's probably an immoral form of capitalism because it ultimately does benefit business owners before it benefits the people. And in like the 1700s, 1600s, this was a big thing because the mercantilists wanted to make money, and they didn't want to trade with other people because they knew that they could have more money if they imposed tariffs and didn't let people trade with other countries. And that is not free trade, and that is benefiting business owners before consumers, and that I would say is not capitalism, but I don't think it's socialism.
How do you make that determination in terms of benefiting business owners ahead of consumers? And where do you sort of draw the line? Almost all job creation in America is done by small business owners. Is that a bad thing?
No, small businesses are a good thing, but when you impose tariffs, you are not, ultimately the cost of something is going to be placed on the consumer shoulders, and free trade allows competition to drive the prices lower and lower and lower. But when you give the people fewer and fewer and fewer options to buy things, the businesses have more control. And so ultimately capitalism is arguing for free market, allow businesses to be created, allow jobs to be created, give the people options, let the consumer vote with their dollar.
So are you postulating that it's morally improper for governments to ever impose price constraints or controls?
No, not always. There are times, such as in the Great Depression, FDR obviously used price controlling to try and regulate the market. And that's just one of the many examples throughout history where we've seen that. And so it's not always morally wrong, but it's when the government then takes that to the next step and they're not trying to correct the government, but then or the economy, but then trying to regulate it to the point where it doesn't necessarily need stimulation, and they're almost correcting it before it ever happens. So they're trying to then redistribute wealth, and they're using it less as a free market correctional tool and more of a confining regulator for the entire economy as a whole.
Camden, you used an interesting word there, correction. Can you define what a correction is, and then who gets to do that? Who gets to decide when a correction is needed and what correction is needed, or if something is a correction or not?
Yes, so corrections often will come when the economy either looks like it's about to go into a spiral, either when it comes to the money flow or when it comes to inflation or deflation. Often a correction will come from either the government through its policies or through the Fed and the bank's policies. And so between those two, money supply and money flow, along with spending and taxation, will all change, and that will allow for a correction for the economy as a whole.
So the Fed?
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah, so isn't the Fed itself a invention of government to apply controls? Because that's certainly not free market.
Well, what he's kind of talking about is those are the two ways that a government can fix that. But there's also in a free market, like the Fed is kind of the government, but at the same time it's kind of not. It's fiscal policy and monetary policy, the way that they can, the government can increase or reduce spending, increase or decrease taxes, and that can all affect the economy and its growth or, And then monetary policy is the increase or decrease in the money supply by open market operations. You can increase or decrease the reserve ratio. There's so many things you can do, and that will all change the economy in those ways. But if you let the free market do what it needs to do, it'll naturally shift supply. Ultimately, the market will decide based off of supply and demand where it needs to be.
Like another, you could say good regulation with like government involvement, like during the Industrial Revolution, like, and it's like, you could say or whatever, there was a lot of corruption, you could say, like with the businesses in which you had like child labor, long hours with not a lot of pay. So that could also be like a good example of time when the government had to like regulate businesses because they were just kind of getting out of control. So that's a good time to do government regulation.
So it sounds like, I mean, just based on what you're saying, that you wouldn't describe the way that the United States operates as an entirely capitalistic, free market government or society.
In a sense, like there are examples. You could say like socialist policies you could say in there to kind of like regulate businesses. Or,
I guess that's where I was going to go. So what policies or procedures do we have in place that maybe lean less in that direction and maybe are a little more socialist?
well, I mean, like you have like a minimum wage in a sense that way, like people are getting paid a certain amount of hours, and you can only work 40 hours a week. You can't work above, so there's no like overtime. And not to mention we have laws that prevent for child labor, so we've kind of gotten a lot better in a sense from that. And, I mean, you can also get paid sometimes for overtime and stuff like that. So there's a little bit of socialist stuff to help regulate. So big, in a sense, of what we can say no to that.
Is that socialism or is that just government, some government guidelines on
It's
free
more,
market?
I
We
guess
call it a
it's-
modified free market maybe?
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
And like some other socialist kind of policies in America would include things like Social Security. A more capitalist version of that would maybe be a privatized version of Social Security. That's just an example.
Why is Social Security socialistic?
Because the current people that are working right now are paying part of the retirement of those who are drawing. Of the people that are working right now are paying the current beneficiaries, and then when the next group of people retires, the people that are working then will pay the beneficiaries, and you're not, obviously you are paying in to receive that later, but it's not all on your own merit, I guess.
I think you gave a really great description of that, Aaron. Is it because the government is orchestrating that makes it more socialist? Because you said it's the free market, or if you turned it over to private industry to run that, basically that exact same program, you just have the private industry running it, does that make it less socialist and more capitalist? Or, I mean, you're still putting together a structured program that has to, in some way, has to run in a certain way based on whatever the mandate is. Does that make it more capitalist if you let private industry run it as opposed to government?
I would say so, yes.
Okay, what about the VA? Is that socialist or is that capitalist?
I did not research the VA.
Are you guys familiar with the VA? Do you know what the VA is? Veterans Affairs, healthcare for our veterans, people who are active and former service members. That is run by the private industry or by the government, do you think? By the government. Okay, and it administers healthcare to those who have served our country. Is that a socialist practice or is that a more capitalistic practice?
That's more socialist practice.
Because
Because it's run by the government.
just
And
for the sake that it's run by the government,
And it's paid for by people who aren't always benefiting from it as well.
so that means more socialism than it does capitalism. Okay, does that make it inherently bad or inherently good?
No,
No,
but
not
when
inherent.
you, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
No,
just,
go ahead.
just having the
I
label.
like when
of
two of you go at the same time. It's great. Yeah, means you're
Just having-
excited.
Yeah, just having the label of socialist doesn't necessarily
Yes.
make it bad. And obviously, because our veterans have served our country,
Right.
you know, we honor and respect them, and therefore that's why you often see people not going up in arms about the VA, because we know that they've served our country in ways that it's hard for us to repay. So therefore, we try and do that through this socialist policy, where then we're then paying into their benefits.
So it's a benefit. I think that's a great
Right.
word you used, Karen. It's a benefit to them. We're just orchestrating it through this particular structure. Well thought.
I'd love to hear a little more, you said that, there are times when government regulation or intervention might be warranted or necessary, and you gave some examples. I'm wondering if you could articulate something more like a principle, something a little more generalized or abstract than just examples in terms of when government action is a good thing as opposed to a bad thing. It's kind of going back to this idea of corrections. What are we correcting? how do we know that it's correct?
So one of the main principles would be stagflation, where there's high inflation and high unemployment. And so then when the government then starts articulating itself throughout the economy, it can then try and solve both of those principles at the same time, whereas the free market might take too long to solve both problems at the same time. So they couldn't necessarily work on both inflation and unemployment, or high inflation and unemployment in a fast enough way that would benefit people in the way that the government could.
Is stagflation though caused by government?
At times it can be, and it depends once again on the amount of government involvement in the economy. But the economy can also come to that on its own if it ends up being run in such a way that wouldn't benefit both sides. Which is why the free market would then start to correct itself over time, but it could end up taking too long, which would mean that the government would then interfere.
Is that what
Two
you
times like that.
That's the next election.
No, I think we're getting closer, but like, what about stagflation makes it bad?
The high levels of unemployment and inflation at the same time,
Why is that bad?
because
Define stagflation. Say why it's
it,
bad.
obviously price levels are increased by a drastic amount, and then when you also have a high number of people that aren't working, that can turn into a humanitarian crisis in no time.
Speaking, I'm sorry, are you good?
If you're a business owner and the high prices might not be such a bad thing.
True. Yeah.
Until the market decides that, oh, we're not willing to pay for these high prices.
What happens then?
Well, that's kind of where the consumer has a lot of say in the capitalist market, and that's a common misconception, I'd say. With every dollar that you spend, you are voting for your company to make it through. And when you can provide a good service or a good product, people will buy your service or product more, and you'll become more successful. Capitalism serves the consumer just as much as it serves the producer. And I completely forgot what I was answering.
That's all right. I would say that what you're illustrating is the power shifts from the producer to the consumer. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because they're voting with their dollars. I mean, to use your analogy. Is that correct? Good.
So is that self-correcting then? I mean, what you just described doesn't sound like government intervention to correct inflation. It sounds like market forces correcting inflation.
So market forces can correct both, but I would say when it comes to inflation, the government can have a pretty efficient role to play in reducing the money supply or increasing taxes.
That's all right, you're good. I was going to say, I'm pretty familiar with capitalism because I happen to live in a nation that practices it predominantly. I'm not as familiar with socialism, though certainly I've seen it mentioned in the news quite a lot recently. Talk to me a little bit about some countries outside the United States that are considered socialist countries. Talk to me about, if you know anything about how they became a socialist country, what the current state of socialism is in their country. Fill me in on a little bit of what's going on around us. What are our neighbors doing?
So there are a lot of countries that would consider themselves socialist or democratic socialist, which is just socialism in a way that the people can then vote on it. So either democratically elected officials into a socialist position, or democratic socialism would just be a socialist that makes the people feel like they have a bit more power. We can go more into that later.
Okay.
But a list of the socialist countries currently, as of 2019, would be Armenia, Bolivia, Brazil, Croatia, Denmark, Ecuador, Finland, France, Germany, Greenland, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Moldova, Netherlands, Nicaragua, Northern Ireland, Norway, Peru, Portugal, Serbia, Slovenia, Sweden, Tunisia, Turkey, UK, and Venezuela. Now, not all of those have socialist governments, though. Those are countries that have socialist economic systems, whereas just Armenia, Bolivia, Ecuador, Iceland, Nicaragua, Portugal, Serbia, and Venezuela all have socialist governments, which is the big distinction in that they have an elected official or sometimes forcibly placed official that is a socialist and therefore uses the government in such a way that would control the market more so